Hi, my name is Paul E. Nelson. I live in Seattle, Washington, in the ancestral homeland of the Duwamish and other coastal Salish peoples. I will be the featured poet for Poems for Peace, ZoomMuse Poems for Peace, on Thursday, February 17 at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, which translates to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. I look forward to talking about the connection between poetry and peace and reading some of my latest work. So see you at ZoomMuse Poems for Peace right here in this Zoom room on Thursday, February 17th at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. I have three current projects. One is American Sentences. I write a 17-syllable poem every day, a form created by Allen Ginsberg to sort of make a North American version of the haiku. Mine are quite often more like senyu, more about social situations rather than nature. But there are a few nature poems. I've written one a day since the beginning of 2001, and two editions of the book American Sentences have been released by Prentice House Press. I'm also working on Flexible Mind, a manuscript, a series of poems that are basically meditations of out my front window here looking at Lake Washington and all the waterfowl, all the birds, all the beavers, the eagles, the coots, and the other wildlife, and of course the beautiful sunrises and views of the Issaquah Alps and Cascades on a good day. Flexible Mind poems are, it comes from a Michael McClure poem in his book, Touching the Edge, Dharma Devotions from the Hummingbird Sangha. And I started writing them a few months after he died. He died in May 4th of 2020, and I started writing them in November, going more deeply into that book. And so they're short meditations, basically on place and what's going on in my life. Also, A Time Before Slaughter and Pig War and Other Songs of Cascadia. A Time Before Slaughter was my first book. It was released in 2010 and shortlisted for a Stranger Genius Award in Literature. It took the history of the town of Slaughter, the original name for Auburn, Washington, and went into some of the history there. A reenactment of the history of Auburn, Washington in experimental lyric verse is what I would call the book. And then in 2020, the 10th anniversary edition added a whole nother book to it, Pig War and Other Songs of Cascadia. So getting more deeply into bioregionalism and to the incident that was a boundary dispute between what would become Canada and the United States over the San Juan Islands. And there was joint military occupancy for 12 years. The only casualty, a pig. No one knows who ate the bacon, but we all know that the United States got the islands, now known as the San Juan Islands. So that story is told, and I continue to work on that, which is my saturation job, my multi-decade research project. And so those are the three projects I'm working on. They're kind of complicated to explain, but they give me great joy to work on. It was interesting because there have been rumblings of cultural appropriation. When I was awarded the Robin Blaser Award by the Capilano Review, it was based on a story, a Haida story told by Robert Bringhurst, who studied Haida and who brought Haida culture to the world through his work. He and other people. And so I did a retelling of that story in verse. It won the Robin Blaser Award, as awarded by George Bowering in 2014, I think it was. And when they announced the prize, they also announced that it was, quote unquote, ringing off bells, because that kind of stuff is not appropriate for Western style poems. I disagree with that. I also talked to a friend who is not a native Lushootseed speaker. That's the Puget Sound Salish dialect, Lushootseed, and Walshootseed, Southern Puget Sound Salish. And he learned from the woman who saved Lushootseed, Tuk Shablu, better known as Vi Hilbert. And when I finally met this majestic presence a few years before she died, I said, "We have a mutual friend." And she said, "Who's that?" And I said, "Greg Watson." She said, "Oh, he was my best student. And he's a hillbilly." He's from Kentucky, and speaks Lashute, can tell stories in Lashute. And I asked him about it, and he said, if you told a story of the history of Cascadia without including, indigenous people and their stories and their culture, they would call it a whitewash. So, you're damned if you do, or you're damned if you don't. And my 1% of native blood, of course, doesn't amount to much, even though I relate very much to indigenous people and their connection, their deep connection to this place in Chief Seattle. The town named after Seattle is an approximate pronunciation in Lashute of the man who this town is named after. This is a little bit of what I've prepared for the Poems for Peace, ZoomMuse Poems for Peace on February 17. Two definitions of bioregionalism are: one, the belief that social organization and environmental policies should be based on bioregions rather than on arbitrary political boundaries. And two, the belief that naturally defined regions, some people call them ecoregions, I like the term bioregion, that should be the basis of political or cultural identity. Now, obviously, we don't believe in violent secession from two federal governments that are involved in Cascadia, the United States and Canada. But culturally, to situate oneself, to imagine oneself culturally as a Cascadian first, and then a US American, or then a Canadian, I think is a transformative act. And it connects one deeper to the land. It connects one more deeply to the real. And you look at Europe, and the countries there, by and large, follow bioregional demarcations. It's rivers, or mountain, the heads of mountains, or the divides in mountains that create many of the boundaries. There's an American sentence I have, I'll paraphrase, but anytime you see straight lines on a map, start asking questions. Nature doesn't work in straight lines, so we need to be more, we need to take our cues from nature more often. And now with the threat to the biosphere, it's more important than ever. And the person who's mainly responsible for the concept of bioregions, Peter Berg, said, saving the biosphere one bioregion at a time. I have a new book. This is a galley version of Haibun de la Serna. And that's a picture of Don Pullen. It's a painting of Don Pullen at the backstage, painted by Bill Turner, who died about a month ago, just over a month ago. I bought this painting. I love it. Amy Evans McClure did the cover. I have copies of the book behind me. I took this out because it's easy to read, and I marked off some poems. The funny thing is that I've got two blurbs and then an old blurb by Sam Hamill that goes into other issues besides Haibun de la Serna. The two blurbs are both by Canadian poets, Michael Bon and Sharon Thiessen. Sharon Thiessen, a former ZoomMuse Poems for Peace reader. So I'm pretty happy about that.
Can you explain what Haibun are?
Yeah, Haibun were essentially invented by Basho about 400 years ago. Sam calls it a medieval Japanese form, I think. So it's an old Japanese form that includes poetic prose with haiku-like moments. Mine are certainly not haiku, but they're shorter poems, and they're designed not to tell the moral of the story necessarily, but to serve as some sort of summation, but in an angular kind of way. Andrew Schelling was very clear about his instructions on Haibun. If you're not a haiku writer, don't try to write haiku. I mean, people will know the difference. It's an art to doing haiku. You don't want it to end up like, what was that dish you were talking about? Poutine shawarma? You don't want to, although people might argue that the poems in here are like poutine shawarma. Michael Bond says, Nelson's poems are gorgeous mongrels, combining the tradition of the Haibun, the innovation of Gomez's imagination, quotation of his gregarias, an immaculate ear, and blah, blah, blah. But I like that notion that these are gorgeous mongrels. They are mongrels for sure. Whether they're gorgeous or not depends on which end you're petting, I guess. Let me read one, Andrew. I have a feeling that's going to be your next question, no?
Yeah, give us a taste.
All right. Here's one. Bhakti and I, my partner, we went to Seward Park yesterday because I thought for sure the first blossom. Well, Sarcococa has already been blossoming here. It's an ornamental shrub, but it comes from Japan. The first native blossom to happen every year around this time is Indian plum. So we looked yesterday in Seward Park. We're just about ready to go. They have these blossoms that come out like this and stand up. It's a very interesting thing. And so I took some material from the Avatamsaka Sutra and merged it into this poem called Hymn to Indian Plum. And the epigraph by Ramon Gomez de la Serna, the interlocking hearts carved on benches are the cheap wedding vows of seducers. And the book is spiritual instrument will not itself thicken your knowledge, will not itself allow your vision to penetrate the evergreen, nor the cliff above obstruction, will not itself lift you up out of animal blinders, or make luminous the February witch hazel's view, or the perched Anna's hummingbird, or the frail first candle flames of the Indian plum. No. Might make a fine widow, to jump in and see the light of the supreme lamp of universal virtue, or the lion banner of universal light, may be an end to the subtle light of flames of universal jewels, or the banner of oceans of qualities of universal sounds. Could open my February window and hear waves below bush tit chatter, or starling gossip and jet engine wash. Maybe wait for a day when, through practice, could envision hearing the pleasing voice of universal awareness, or the undefiled treasury of light of oceans of cloud-like sounds. Could make a top knot out of that. Could imagine it instead of a whirl of pheromones, or a goatskin jail cell in which to feel the beatdown of bruxism. Could envision a light banner of fragrant flames each morning before yoga and truck growl, before slaughter and dehydration, before the animal inside aware of extensive root systems, and their eloquent oceans of concentrations that sometimes emit the scent of magnolia blossoms, or jalapeno, or jasmine. Pick a vow, at least as radiant as the first leaf shoots of the February Indian plum. So a couple of references to Subud culture and the notion of the hierarchy of life forces, because there's the reference to animal blinders. So are we stuck in the animal life force? And again, before slaughter, a nod to my first book and the original name of Auburn, Washington. My book was A Time Before Slaughter, so slaughter continues to be a theme in my work. This notion of trying to control something rather than help facilitate its liberation. And before slaughter and dehydration, before the animal inside aware of such and such a thing. So Subud comes in, and in my more and more in my time in Subud, I'm approaching my 18th anniversary, so I know I'm a youngster in Subud, but I still love it very much.
Well said. Is there another poem you'd like to share with us for this teaser interview?
Yes, I mentioned sake. There's a sake that Sam turned me on to called Otokoyama, and it's delicious. I will be having some. I don't know if I'll have Otokoyama tomorrow night, but I will be having some sake to celebrate a friend's birthday. My good friend Tetsuzen Jason Worth, who had he's having a birthday today, and we'll celebrate tomorrow at the sushi bar. And this poem was written at the lake, which was the final home of Morris Graves, the legendary painter, whose best creations, most inspired, may be the places that he lived. And I was very fortunate to get a residency at the lake in Lolita, California, extreme southern Cascadia. Went through his letters, his collected letters, which was rich with all kinds of inspiration. And there are several quotes by Graves in this poem that I snatched and put in italics. And it's called Clues from Hell. It's number 97, so it's very near the end of the series of 99 Haibun. Ramon Gomez de la Serna on that occasion was known to say, "Smoke rises to heaven when it ought to descend to hell." And heavens of your making a home, be it the rock or Caerlaten, Woodtown or the lake, Cagayan or Cloud Nine, Slaughter or a little corner of Hillman City survivable by pea patch, make it with enough care to notice from the lichen to the day moon, from the library to the Japanese maple, from the giant sunflowers to the three-steepled cedar points to better weather. In it, and in the chaos of the marked-up books, the three-toed vase, the empty Otokoyama bottles in the recycle bin, clues. To sift through the wreckage one day, they'll want clues. Clues to how you ended up next to a fire, well tended, and clues to the spiritual chase. Clues to the record and direction for future seekers, and clues to where you hid the Humboldt fog. Clues could hide right in front of you, as does the sponge plant by the duckweed drift, which smears the morning lake. Clues of cigarette butts and grief. Old growth redwood, 800 years old, 300 feet tall, heard its share of prayers. They were always there, we'll say, prominent as miniature islands with salal, blue huckleberry, and dwarfed spruce, calm as the lake ripples made by a coot flock landing, subtle as the wood smoke rejecting hell in the making of its new home as it courts the morning Cascadia fog. Sincere as autumn bouquets, sweet little nosegay-like for every dead stranger in the cemetery, made with a spirit of great cobwebs of geese in the sky and mild-mannered hallucinations of reverse snow in September Olympic fireweed, or the hush of dropping fir needles with each new exhale from Blue Glacier. So, stock up on cake mix and tequila, butter and turkey bacon, mangos y pan de banana. Have handy jasmine rice and altar candles, fresh garlic and olive oil, cashew bits and blush wine, wool socks and binoculars, photos of the loved ones, and always the clue-enabling ancestors. Decoding the sea and the heavens ain't for sissies. Lend a hand or stand back. That's also a line from Morris Graves. Decoding the sea and the heavens ain't for sissies. Yeah, well, peace starts from within. I mean, that's been taught for centuries. And how do we get that? How are we a force for peace in our own lives and a force for peace in our neighborhoods? I think being open, realizing you don't have to. Most people in the world, it's human nature to gather together based on prejudices, and it's not sustainable, especially in a mosaic country like Canada or a melting pot country like the United States. And I feel very touched to have made friends with Aikio, who is a local graffiti artist who's making beautiful art on the sidewalk by the Mapes Creek walkway. And I congratulated him on it. I wrote a poem about it that included the Aboriginal name of this creek. We call it Mapes Creek, but the natives called it Tux Uquib. And he put that into some of his graffiti art just the other day. And also a line about that I used to describe him as a galactic traveler based on some of the planets and nebulae that I saw in his work. And I thought it was a very touching tribute and gesture of friendship. And I was tickled by it. I'm going to blog about that he said he was really pleased to be able to know people like me, and I'm really pleased to be able to know people like him. And I think that kind of activity is at the core of what peace is. So I'm looking forward to being the ZoomMuse Poems for Peace poet on Thursday, February 17, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. Thank you for your interest, and go in peace. Vaya con Dios.